The letters arrived without warning. No return address. No fingerprints. Just thin white envelopes slid quietly into mailboxes, left on windshields, sometimes taped to front doors in the early hours before dawn. Inside were pages filled with careful handwriting. Calm. Deliberate. Almost polite. But every letter carried the same promise. I'm watching her. At first, no one knew who her was. The police dismissed the earliest reports as harassment. A prank. Someone with too much time and not enough sense. But the letters kept coming. Different neighborhoods. Different handwriting styles, yet unmistakably the same voice. The same unsettling calm. The same obsessive focus. And then, one morning, a woman didn't show up for work. Her name was Linda Alvarez. She was 27 years old, lived alone in a modest apartment complex just outside San Jose, and worked as a records clerk at a small medical office. By all accounts, she was careful. Quiet. Predictable. The kind of person who locked her doors twice and never took shortcuts home at night. When her supervisor called to check on her, the phone rang unanswered. When a coworker stopped by that evening, Linda's car was still parked neatly in its assigned spot. Her curtains were half drawn. The porch light was off. Nothing looked disturbed. Inside, her apartment told a different story. Her purse lay open on the kitchen counter. Keys still inside. A cup of coffee sat cold and untouched near the sink. The bed was made. Too perfectly made. As if she'd never slept in it at all. There were no signs of forced entry. No struggle. No blood. Just absence. The police classified it as a missing persons case. Another file among hundreds. But 2 days later, the first letter arrived at the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. It was addressed simply to whoever finds her. Inside was a single page. She didn't scream. I made sure of that. The case shifted instantly. Detectives began retracing Linda's final days, her routines, her contacts. Friends described nothing unusual. No arguments. No ex-boyfriends. No threats. No stalker that she'd mentioned. But when investigators searched her apartment more closely, they found something she hadn't told anyone about. A stack of letters. Hidden inside a showbox at the back of her closet. They were neatly folded, arranged in chronological order, spanning nearly 8 months. Each one addressed to Linda. Each one unsigned. Each one growing more intimate. More possessive. More disturbing. The earliest letters were flattering. Observations about her clothing. Compliments on her smile. References to seeing her at the grocery store, the bus stop, the dry cleaners. Things that could be coincidence. Things that might have felt harmless at first. Later letters changed tone. I don't like it when you talk to other men. You should be careful walking alone at night. I know when you leave your lights on by mistake. Linda had never reported them. In the margins of one letter, written in her own hand, investigators found a single sentence. Probably just someone lonely. That sentence would haunt the case for decades. As the letters became public knowledge, more women came forward. Women from nearby towns. Women who worked different jobs, lived in different buildings, followed different routines. Yet the letters they brought with them were unmistakably similar. Same phrasing. Same fixation. Same sense of entitlement. And the same escalation. Police now faced a terrifying possibility. This wasn't a single obsession. It was a pattern. A stalker who moved patiently, methodically, choosing targets and studying them for months before acting. Then another letter arrived. This one included a detail that hadn't been released to the public. A detail only the killer could know. The task force expanded overnight. Profilers were brought in. Mail routes were traced. Handwriting experts compared loops and pressure points. Linguists dissected sentence structure, word choice, even punctuation habits. The letters, they said, were the key. The writer craved recognition. Control. He wanted to be read. Understood. Feared. And he wasn't finished. 3 weeks after Linda disappeared, the body of a second woman was found in a shallow ravine near Highway 17. She had been strangled. No identification on her. But tucked carefully into her jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper. I told you I was watching. The city began to change. Women altered their routines. Neighbors walked each other to their cars. Locks were upgraded. Porch lights stayed on all night. Every unfamiliar sound became suspicious. Every shadow felt closer than it should. And still, the letters kept coming. Some were sent to the police. Others to local newspapers. A few to the victims' families. Each one more confident than the last. Each one daring investigators to catch him. What no one realized yet was that the letters weren't just taunts. They were breadcrumbs. A trail the killer believed no one was smart enough to follow. The woman who survived almost didn't come forward. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and for weeks she convinced herself that what happened to her was coincidence. Bad luck. A misunderstanding. Anything but what it actually was. She lived 30 miles north of Linda's apartment, in a quiet neighborhood where people waved at each other from their driveways and left garage doors open during the day. Karen was 32, recently divorced, worked evenings as a dental hygienist, and prided herself on being observant. Cautious. The first letter arrived taped to her mailbox. "I like the way you check your mirrors when you drive." She laughed when she read it. A nervous laugh, but still a laugh. Someone had a crush. Someone was being weird. She tore it up and threw it away. The second letter mentioned the exact route she took home from work. The third described the scar on her left ankle. That one she didn't throw away. Karen started changing her routine. Different routes. Different grocery store. She stopped jogging in the evenings. She told herself she was being smart, not scared. But fear crept in anyway, quiet and relentless. One night, as she pulled into her driveway, her headlights caught movement near her side gate. A figure stepped back into the shadows. She never saw his face. Only the way he moved. Calm. Unhurried. As if he belonged there. The next morning, a letter waited on her porch. "You shouldn't surprise me like that." That was when she went to the police. Detectives listened carefully, comparing her letters to the others. The similarities were undeniable. Same pacing. Same tone. Same unsettling mix of admiration and threat. But there was something else now, something new. A mistake. One word appeared repeatedly across the letters. A misspelling so consistent it felt intentional. Definitely. Not definitely. Definitely. Handwriting experts flagged it immediately. Linguists circled it in red. The probability of the same misspelling appearing across dozens of letters wasn't coincidence. It was habit. A fingerprint made of ink. They cross-referenced the error against prior cases. Against known offenders. Against archived correspondence from earlier unsolved stalking incidents across California. That's when something unexpected surfaced. In 1974, 6 years before Linda vanished, a small police department in Santa Cruz had received anonymous letters following the murder of a college student. The killer had never been identified. The letters had been dismissed as a hoax when no further violence followed. The same misspelling appeared. The letters were pulled from storage, yellowed and brittle. When laid side by side with the current ones, the resemblance was chilling. Sentence rhythms matched. The same oddly formal phrasing. The same insistence that the victims belonged to someone who had never spoken to them. This wasn't a new killer. He had been practicing. Investigators began mapping the letters geographically, pinning locations on a massive board that slowly filled the task force room wall. What emerged wasn't random. It was a corridor. A loose but deliberate path following job centers, bus routes, and mailing facilities. He wasn't just watching the women. He was watching the system. Then the newspapers received a letter that changed everything. Unlike the others, this one wasn't handwritten. It was typed. Clean. Precise. Confident. And at the bottom, a single line appeared in bold. "You're finally getting closer. Don't stop now." The killer had noticed the shift in police tactics. The increased patrols. The quiet surveillance near post offices. The subtle pressure being applied. And instead of retreating, he adapted. For the first time, fear cracked the investigative team. Because this wasn't someone panicking. This was someone enjoying the game. Days later, Linda Alvarez's body was found. She had been buried in a shallow grave near an abandoned orchard, wrapped carefully in plastic. There were no signs of prolonged restraint. No defensive wounds. Her death was efficient. Controlled. Almost clinical. But what chilled detectives most was what lay beside her. A sealed envelope. Inside was a letter written after her death. "She trusted me." That was the hardest part. The killer had stayed long enough to write. The profile sharpened overnight. This wasn't rage-driven violence. It wasn't impulsive. This was about possession. About being seen. About proving superiority over law enforcement and over the victims themselves. And now, with 2 confirmed murders and 1 near abduction, the task force knew the truth. If they didn't stop him soon, there would be more letters. More women. More graves hidden in plain sight. What they didn't know yet was that the killer had already made his biggest mistake. A mistake buried not in what he wrote, but in how he mailed it. The envelope that broke the case didn't look special. No symbols. No taunts. No dramatic phrasing on the outside. Just an ordinary manila envelope, addressed in block letters, dropped into a public mailbox like all the others. But this one had weight. Not physical weight. Behavioral weight. Postal inspectors joined the task force, something that hadn't happened before. Every letter sent so far had been postmarked from different towns, different days, different drop boxes. A classic attempt to confuse location tracking. This one was different. It had been mailed during a narrow window, late evening, from a sorting hub mailbox used primarily by employees finishing second shift. The timestamp narrowed it to less than 30 minutes. And the adhesive on the envelope wasn't licked. It was sealed with a sponge. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at first. A sponge-sealed envelope suggested routine. Someone used to handling mail in volume. Someone who avoided saliva because they knew about trace evidence. Someone trained. Postal records showed only a handful of workers had access to that specific mailbox during that specific window. Fewer still worked jobs that took them across county lines, matching the letter distribution pattern. One name appeared repeatedly. Robert Hale. He was 39 years old. Married. No children. Employed as a regional courier supervisor for a private logistics contractor that handled overflow mail for the U.S. Postal Service. His route history matched nearly every letter drop location. On paper, he was invisible. No criminal record. No complaints. No prior arrests. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, forgettable. The kind of man you wouldn't remember 5 minutes after meeting him. Detectives watched him for weeks. They noted his habits. How he drove the speed limit exactly. How he stopped at the same diner every morning. How he always parked in the farthest corner of lots, away from other cars. How he wrote grocery lists in neat, careful handwriting. And then they searched his trash. Inside were torn fragments of paper. Carefully shredded by hand. Not crosscut. Not machine destroyed. Pieces investigators patiently reconstructed like a puzzle. When the fragments were taped together, a familiar word appeared. Definitely. The warrant followed within hours. Hale didn't resist when they knocked. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't deny knowing Linda Alvarez or Karen Mitchell. He simply nodded and asked if he could put his shoes on. Inside his home, investigators found a room his wife said she never entered. A locked spare bedroom at the back of the house. He had told her it was for work storage. She believed him. The walls were lined with corkboard. Photographs. Maps. Timelines. Names written in careful block letters. Every woman linked by red thread. Routes traced in blue ink. Letter drafts pinned beside final versions. And in the center of the room, a small metal filing cabinet. Inside were copies of every letter he had ever sent. Including letters never mailed. Practice letters. On his desk sat a stack of envelopes already addressed. Already stamped. Waiting. When confronted with the evidence, Robert Hale finally spoke. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," he said. "I just thought it would take longer." During interrogation, Hale showed no remorse. No anger. No fear. He spoke about the women as if they were characters in a story he was writing. He insisted he had loved them. That he had protected them. That the world had misunderstood his intentions. When asked why he escalated to murder, his answer was simple. They stopped paying attention. The trial gripped California. Prosecutors used the letters as their backbone. Each misspelling. Each phrasing quirk. Each mailing choice became a strand in a web Hale couldn't escape. Karen Mitchell testified, her voice steady as she described the night she almost disappeared. Hale never looked at her. The jury convicted him on all counts. He was sentenced to life without parole. But the case didn't end there. Years later, investigators reviewing cold cases found letters in other states. Letters that matched Hale's style. Letters sent during periods when he traveled for work. Letters connected to disappearances that were never solved. Cases that, officially, remain open. Because some letters were never signed. And some victims were never found. Even now, those letters are stored in evidence rooms. Carefully sealed. Carefully preserved. Ink faded, but words still sharp. A reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who hide in the shadows. They're the ones who move quietly through systems we trust. And leave their thoughts behind in envelopes, hoping someone will read them. Robert Hale's conviction didn't bring the relief the city expected. For a few weeks, there was applause. Headlines declared the nightmare over. Editorials praised the task force. Women walked a little more freely again. Porch lights flicked off at night. California exhaled. But inside the homes of the victims' families, nothing felt finished. Linda Alvarez's parents sat through the sentencing in silence. No tears. No outbursts. Just stillness. When reporters asked Linda's mother if justice had been served, she paused for a long time before answering. "He learned everything about her," she said. "And we'll never know who she would have become." Karen Mitchell moved out of state less than a year later. She never returned to that house. Never worked evenings again. Loud footsteps behind her still made her heart race, decades later. Survival didn't erase the damage. It simply changed its shape. The task force, however, couldn't let go. Hale's calm confidence during interrogation unsettled them. The way he spoke about practice letters. The drafts never mailed. The meticulous organization. This wasn't a man who acted once and stopped. So they kept digging. Travel records were subpoenaed. Employment logs reviewed. Hotel stays matched against unsolved disappearances across California, Nevada, and Oregon. In several towns, local police remembered letters that had been dismissed years earlier. Anonymous notes. Creepy observations. No follow-up violence, so no urgency. Now those letters were pulled from dusty evidence lockers. The patterns lined up. Same misspelling. Same sentence rhythm. Same fixation on routine and ownership. But the bodies were missing. In at least 4 cases, women had vanished during periods when Hale's work placed him within driving distance. No remains were ever found. No witnesses came forward. Only the letters remained. Prosecutors wanted additional charges. But without physical evidence, the cases stalled. Hale refused to speak further. His attorneys warned him into silence. The truth, whatever remained of it, stayed locked behind concrete walls. Inside prison, Hale adapted quickly. He followed rules. Kept to himself. Volunteered in the library. Other inmates described him as polite, distant, forgettable. Guards noted he wrote often. Long letters. Pages and pages. Most addressed to no one in particular. When prison officials screened his mail, they found something familiar. He still misspelled definitely. The letters were never sent. They were confiscated and added to his growing file. Years passed. The case slipped into textbooks and criminology courses. Hale became an example. A cautionary tale. Proof that obsession could hide behind normalcy. That monsters didn't always look monstrous. But the families never stopped wondering. How many more letters had there been? How many warnings ignored? How many women read those words and convinced themselves it was nothing? Police departments across the state quietly updated their protocols. Stalking complaints were taken more seriously. Anonymous letters logged instead of discarded. Behavioral linguistics became standard in task force training. Linda Alvarez's name appeared in those manuals. Not as a victim. As a lesson. Because what her case exposed wasn't just one killer. It was a system trained to look for violence only after blood appeared. And even now, in evidence rooms across the West Coast, there are envelopes no one has fully explained. Letters that match Hale's style but don't fit his timeline. Misspellings that feel too familiar. Words that echo a voice already known. Some investigators believe Hale wasn't alone. Others believe he inspired someone else. And a few believe the letters were never meant to stop. They were meant to continue long after him. By the mid-1990s, Robert Hale's name rarely appeared in newspapers anymore. New cases replaced old ones. New fears took the place of familiar ones. Time did what it always does, it moved forward, whether justice felt complete or not. But the letters never disappeared. They sat in climate-controlled evidence rooms, sealed in plastic, labeled with dates and case numbers. To most people, they were just paper. To the investigators who had handled them, they still felt alive. Each one a frozen moment of intent. A voice preserved long after the body that created it was locked away. Criminology students studied them now. They learned how obsession evolves. How entitlement disguises itself as affection. How danger often announces itself softly, politely, long before it turns violent. Hale's letters became required reading in behavioral analysis courses, not because they were dramatic, but because they were ordinary. That ordinariness was the most frightening part. Linda Alvarez's story was retold every year at a quiet victims awareness seminar in Santa Clara County. Her photograph sat on a table beside a candle. Not the image taken from her driver's license, but one her family chose, Linda smiling, slightly out of focus, mid-laugh. Alive. Unaware. The speaker always ended the same way. She thought it was nothing. Those 4 words carried more weight than any warning sign or checklist. Karen Mitchell, years later, wrote a letter of her own. Not to Hale. Not to police. But to women she would never meet. It was published anonymously in a self-help journal, her name removed, her story softened. If someone is watching you, she wrote, believe yourself. Fear is not weakness. It's information. The case reshaped policy, but it also reshaped memory. People began to understand that some crimes don't begin with violence. They begin with attention. With someone deciding they have a right to observe, to comment, to insert themselves into another person's life. Hale had believed the letters were his legacy. He was wrong. His words didn't immortalize him. They exposed him. What endured instead were the voices he tried to silence. The routines forever altered. The caution passed quietly between women. The unspoken rule to trust the unease that doesn't yet have a name. In the end, the letters didn't prove how clever he was. They proved how patient evil can be. And how costly it is when it's ignored. Because every mystery leaves behind a voice. Some are whispered. Some are written. And some, like Linda's, are heard only when it's already too late. Robert Hale died in prison in the winter of 2009. There was no announcement. No headline. Just a brief notice buried in a corrections report. Cause of death listed as natural. Age 58. The kind of ending that felt smaller than the damage he left behind. No one attended a memorial. No one claimed his letters. But the cases he touched did not die with him. In Santa Clara County, Linda Alvarez's file remains open, even though her killer was named and convicted. It stays open because investigators know the truth isn't always complete just because a verdict exists. Closure, they learned, is not the same thing as understanding. Every few years, a detective unfamiliar with the original case reads the letters again for the first time. The reaction is always the same. A pause. A tightening of the jaw. A quiet realization that the danger had been visible long before it became deadly. And that recognition matters. Because justice isn't only about punishment. It's about recognition. It's about believing people when they say something feels wrong, even if there's no broken window, no bruises, no body yet. It's about hearing the voice behind the fear before it's silenced. Linda Alvarez didn't get to write her own ending. But her story changed how others were heard. The protocols rewritten because of her case have stopped letters from being ignored. Have escalated stalking complaints. Have saved lives that will never know her name, and don't need to. That is a form of justice the courtroom can't measure. Somewhere in an evidence archive, those envelopes still exist. The ink is fading now. The paper growing brittle. But the warning inside them hasn't aged at all. Attention can be dangerous. Silence can be deadly. And sometimes, the breakthrough doesn't come from fingerprints or witnesses or confessions. It comes from words. Written quietly. Sent patiently. Waiting for someone to finally read them the right way. Every mystery deserves a voice. And today, we heard it.